Julia Bennett's seemingly perfect life unravels when she falls into a forbidden affair with her charismatic coworker, Noah. What begins as a reckless escape from her stagnant marriage quickly spirals into a web of lies, betrayal, and manipulation. As her husband Evan discovers the truth, Julia's world crumbles, forcing her to confront shocking revelations about those she trusted most. The story dives deep into infidelity, deceit, and betrayal, leaving audiences enraged at the selfish choices and hidden motives that threaten to destroy lives and reputations. Welcome back, and thanks for tuning in to the Cheating Diaries, where secrets unravel and betrayals come to light. Before we dive into today's story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, grab your popcorn, because this one's about to get intense. It started with a smile, the kind that lingers just a little too long to be innocent. Julia Bennett didn't think much of it at first. After all, smiles were harmless, or so she told herself. Julia had always been the kind of woman people trusted, 34 years old, sharp as a tack, and a senior marketing manager at Archer Co. She was the glue that held her department together. Her coworkers admired her friends envied her, and her husband. Well, Evan Bennett had worshipped her, or at least, he used to. They met in college, the classic love story. He was a law student. She was studying business. They built their lives brick by brick, first the wedding, then the house, and finally, the golden retriever, to complete the picture. 12 years later, they still looked like the perfect couple, but looks can be deceiving. Julia sat at her desk, scrolling through emails when she saw it, a meeting invite labeled, Private Marketing Strategy Updates, from Noah Carter. Noah was new to the company, a fresh hire with an Ivy League degree, and a jawline sharp enough to cut glass. He'd been assigned to Julia's team 3 months earlier, and since then, their conversations had stayed strictly professional. Until now. Should I be worried? Julia joked as she stepped into the conference room. Noah was already there, sleeves rolled up, leaning casually against the desk. Only if you hate compliments, he said, handing her a printed report. Their eyes met, and for the first time in years, Julia felt something, a spark. She laughed it off and sat down, flipping through the report, but her heart wasn't focused on the numbers. That meeting set everything in motion. By the time Julia got home that evening, her thoughts were still circling Noah. She walked into the house, the scent of garlic and roasted chicken hitting her like a wave. Evan was in the kitchen, apron on, humming along to a Spotify playlist. "You're home late," he said, smiling. "I thought I'd surprise you with dinner." Guilt hit her like a punch to the gut. She kissed his cheek and murmured, "You're too good to me." But as they sat down to eat, her phone buzzed. A text from Noah. "Great work today, I meant what I said. You're impressive." Julia stared at the screen a second too long. "Who's that?" Evan asked, pouring her another glass of wine. "Just work," she said quickly, locking her phone and changing the subject. But Evan noticed the flicker of hesitation. It was subtle, but it was there. And that's when the first crack appeared in their foundation. Over the next few weeks, Julia and Noah's meetings became more frequent and more personal. They lingered after hours, pretending to talk about budgets and campaigns, while stealing glances that said more than words ever could. Noah knew what he was doing. He'd seen the way Julia's eyes lit up when he complimented her ideas, or asked about her favorite books, and Julia. She told herself it was harmless. She wasn't doing anything wrong, yet. But then came the business trip. It was a 3-day conference in Chicago, and Julia hadn't been this excited about work in years. Evan kissed her goodbye at the airport, his hand lingering on her back. "Call me when you land," he said. She promised she would, but by the time her plane touched down, Noah was already waiting at baggage claim, grinning like he'd won the lottery. They spent the first day in meetings, keeping things professional. But that evening, after a cocktail mixer, Noah suggested they grab dinner at a steakhouse nearby. Julia hesitated. She knew what this looked like. "I'm married," she reminded herself, as she slipped into the booth across from him. "I know," Noah said, pouring her another glass of wine. "And he's a lucky guy." The words lingered in the air, heavy and dangerous. Julia could feel the shift, like the ground tilting beneath her feet. And yet, she didn't move. By the time they got back to the hotel, the line had blurred so much it was barely visible. Noah walked her to her door, hesitating just long enough for Julia to make the first move, or walk away. She didn't walk away. What happened next felt inevitable, like gravity pulling her under. And once she crossed that line, there was no going back. The next morning, Julia woke up tangled in hotel sheets that weren't hers. Panic surged through her veins as reality came crashing down. She was still married. She still had a life waiting for her back home. Noah stirred beside her, reaching for her hand. "No regrets?" Julia forced a smile, but her stomach churned. "No regrets," she lied. The guilt followed her home like a shadow. Evan greeted her at the door with flowers, smiling like nothing had changed. But Julia had changed, and it was only a matter of time before Evan noticed. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her phone buzzed, a text from Noah. "Miss you already." And just like that, the guilt was drowned out by something stronger. It started with a smile, the kind that lingers just a little too long to be innocent. Julia Bennett didn't think much of it at first. After all, smiles were harmless, or so she told herself. Julia had always been the kind of woman people trusted, 34 years old, sharp as a tack, and a senior marketing manager at Archer Co. She was the glue that held her department together. Her coworkers admired her, her friends envied her, and her husband, well, Evan Bennett had worshipped her, or at least he used to. They met in college, the classic love story. He was a law student. She was studying business. They built their lives brick by brick. First the wedding, then the house, and finally, the golden retriever to complete the picture. 12 years later, they still looked like the perfect couple, but looks can be deceiving. Julia sat at her desk, scrolling through emails when she saw it. A meeting invite labeled, "Private Marketing Strategy Updates," from Noah Carter. Noah was new to the company, a fresh hire with an Ivy League degree, and a jawline sharp enough to cut glass. He'd been assigned to Julia's team 3 months earlier, and since then, their conversations had stayed strictly professional, until now. "Should I be worried?" Julia joked, as she stepped into the conference room. Noah was already there, sleeves rolled up, leaning casually against the desk. "Only if you hate compliments," he said, handing her a printed report. Their eyes met, and for the first time in years, Julia felt something, a spark. She laughed it off and sat down, flipping through the report. But her heart wasn't focused on the numbers. That meeting set everything in motion. By the time Julia got home that evening, her thoughts were still circling Noah. She walked into the house, the scent of garlic and roasted chicken hitting her like a wave. Evan was in the kitchen, apron on, humming along to a playlist. "You're home late," he said, smiling. "I thought I'd surprise you with dinner." Guilt hit her like a punch to the gut. She kissed his cheek and murmured, "You're too good to me." But as they sat down to eat, her phone buzzed. A text from Noah. "Great work today. I meant what I said. You're impressive." Julia stared at the screen a second too long. "Who's that?" Evan asked, pouring her another glass of wine. "Just work," she said quickly, locking her phone and changing the subject. But Evan noticed the flicker of hesitation. It was subtle, but it was there. And that's when the first crack appeared in their foundation. Over the next few weeks, Julia and Noah's meetings became more frequent and more personal. They lingered after hours, pretending to talk about budgets and campaigns, while stealing glances that said more than words ever could. Noah knew what he was doing. He'd seen the way Julia's eyes lit up when he complimented her ideas or asked about her favorite books. And Julia, she told herself it was harmless. She wasn't doing anything wrong, yet. But then came the business trip. It was a 3-day conference in Chicago, and Julia hadn't been this excited about work in years. Evan kissed her goodbye at the airport, his hand lingering on her back. "Call me when you land," he said. She promised she would, but by the time her plane touched down, Noah was already waiting at baggage claim, grinning like he'd won the lottery. They spent the first day in meetings, keeping things professional. But that evening, after a cocktail mixer, Noah suggested they grab dinner at a steakhouse nearby. Julia hesitated. She knew what this looked like. "I'm married," she reminded herself as she slipped into the booth across from him. "I know," Noah said, pouring her another glass of wine. "And he's a lucky guy." The words lingered in the air, heavy, and dangerous. Julia could feel the shift, like the ground tilting beneath her feet. And yet, she didn't move. By the time they got back to the hotel, the line had blurred so much it was barely visible. Noah walked her to her door, hesitating just long enough for Julia to make the first move, or walk away. She didn't walk away. What happened next felt inevitable, like gravity pulling her under, and once she crossed that line, there was no going back. The next morning, Julia woke up, tangled in hotel sheets that weren't hers. Panic surged through her veins as reality came crashing down. She was still married. She still had a life waiting for her back home. Noah stirred beside her, reaching for her hand. No regrets? Julia forced a smile, but her stomach churned. No regrets, she lied. The guilt followed her home like a shadow. Evan greeted her at the door with flowers, smiling like nothing had changed. But Julia had changed, and it was only a matter of time before Evan noticed. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her phone buzzed. A text from Noah. "Miss you already." And just like that, the guilt was drowned out by something stronger. Julia couldn't stop checking her phone. Every buzz sent her heart racing, and every text from Noah made her stomach flip. It wasn't just the thrill anymore. It was the addiction. Back at work, the tension between them was palpable. Noah had stopped pretending he brushed against her in the hallway, lingered near her desk, and always found an excuse to call her into his office. Julia knew people were starting to notice, especially Chelsea, the office gossip who seemed to have radar for this kind of drama. "Late night again?" Chelsea teased one afternoon. As Julia walked past her desk, Julia froze. "What's that supposed to mean?" Chelsea smirked. "Oh, nothing. Just that you and Noah seem busy these days." Julia laughed it off, but her hands were trembling when she reached her office. She shut the door and checked her messages. Noah had sent another text. "I can't stop thinking about you." Neither could she. At home, Evan's questions were getting harder to dodge. He noticed when she worked late, when she guarded her phone like a lifeline, and when she avoided intimacy. He didn't say anything directly. At least, not yet. But his eyes said enough. Then came the night Julia's world started to crack wide open. It was a Friday, and Evan had planned a date night, dinner at their favorite Italian place. Julia said she had to stay late at work, but instead of heading to her office, she drove straight to Noah's apartment. They barely made it through the door before their clothes hit the floor. It felt reckless, dangerous, and completely intoxicating. But halfway through, Julia's phone buzzed. Evan's name lighting up the screen. She ignored it. When she finally got home hours later, Evan was waiting in the living room. The TV was off, and so was his usual easygoing demeanor. "Where were you?" Julia's breath caught. "I told you I had to work late. Don't lie to me." Evan's voice was calm, but there was something sharp underneath it. Julia's stomach churned. "What are you talking about? You didn't answer your phone. I called your office. You weren't there." Her mind raced for an excuse, but nothing came. She saw the hurt in his eyes and hated herself for causing it. "How long?" Evan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She swallowed hard. "A couple of months." Evan's jaw tightened. "And what happens now? Do you love him?" Tears welled in her eyes. "I don't know." Evan didn't wait for an explanation. The moment Julia admitted the affair, he grabbed his keys and walked out. She chased after him, but the front door slammed before she could say another word. For the first time, Julia felt the weight of what she'd done. The silence of the house pressed down on her like a suffocating fog. She checked her phone. No messages. She called Evan, but it went straight to voicemail. Panic set in. She had risked everything for Noah, but now it felt like she was losing both men. Noah, however, didn't seem worried. When she called him the next day, his voice was calm, even cheerful. "He'll come around," he said. "Trust me, guys like that always do." But Julia wasn't so sure Evan wasn't answering, and she couldn't stop picturing the look on his face when he confronted her. It wasn't anger, it was betrayal. 3 days passed before she heard from him again. It was a text. "We need to talk. 7 p.m. Be home." Julia spent the entire day rehearsing what she'd say. She'd beg for forgiveness. She'd promise to fix things. She'd end things with Noah for good, if that's what it took. But when Evan walked through the door, He wasn't holding flowers. He was holding a folder. "Sit down," he said. Julia's knees buckled as she sank into the couch. Evan dropped the folder onto the coffee table. Photos spilled out. Her and Noah outside the hotel, outside his apartment, even kissing in the parking garage at work. Julia's mouth went dry. "Where did you get these?" Evan's expression was ice. "I hired a private investigator." Julia stared at the photos, her heart pounding. "Why?" "Because I knew," he said. "I've known for weeks, Julia, but I needed proof." Her eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry I made a mistake." "No," Evan snapped. "You made choices over and over again." Julia reached for his hand, but he pulled away. "Don't." His voice cracked. "You don't get to play the victim here. Please," she begged. "We can fix this." Evan shook his head. "You already broke it." Then he dropped the final bombshell. "I filed for divorce." Julia froze. "No, we can't. It's done." He pushed the papers toward her. "Sign them." Julia felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her. She had thought she could fix this. She thought Evan would fight for their marriage, but he wasn't fighting. He was walking away. And just like that, Julia's world came crashing down. Noah was her only comfort now, but something felt different. He wasn't answering her calls as often, and when he did, he sounded distant. The first real red flag came a week later. Julia was scrolling through social media when she saw it. Noah at a bar, his arm around another woman. Her stomach dropped. She texted him immediately. "Who is she?" The reply came an hour later. "Relax. She's just a friend." But Julia didn't feel relaxed. She felt sick. Desperate for answers, she drove to Noah's apartment, but when she knocked, there was no answer. She tried calling, straight to voicemail. Then, she noticed something. A woman's purse sitting by the door. Julia's hands shook as she knocked again, harder this time. Finally, the door opened, and there he was. "Noah, what's going on?" He looked annoyed. "Julia, you can't just show up here." "Who's inside?" "Nobody," he lied. But before he could close the door, the woman appeared behind him, wearing one of his shirts. Julia's world spun. "Are you kidding me?" Noah didn't even flinch. "This isn't what it looks like." But Julia wasn't stupid. "It's exactly what it looks like." The woman slipped back into the apartment, and Noah stepped outside, closing the door behind him. "You need to calm down," he said, lowering his voice. "Calm down?" Julia's voice shook. "I threw my entire life away for you." Noah's expression hardened. "I didn't ask you to." Those words hit harder than any slap. "You said you loved me," she whispered. Noah shrugged. "People say a lot of things in the heat of the moment." Julia felt her stomach drop. "You're a liar." "I'm a realist," he shot back. "You knew what this was." Before she could respond, he turned and went back inside, locking the door. Julia stood there in shock. Everything she had risked, her marriage, her career, her reputation, was gone. And Noah had moved on without a second thought. But Julia wasn't finished. Back at home, she poured herself a drink and opened her laptop. She wasn't just angry, she was furious. If Noah wanted to play dirty, so could she. She started with his social media, digging through his posts and tagged photos. It didn't take long to find evidence of other women, multiple women, and some of them worked at their company. Julia sent an anonymous email to HR, attaching screenshots and timestamps. Within days, Noah was called into a meeting. By the end of the week, he was fired, but it wasn't enough. Julia wanted him to feel what she felt, betrayed, humiliated, and completely alone. She reached out to one of the women in the photos, pretending to be a friend. It didn't take much to get her talking. "He does this all the time," the woman admitted. "He makes you feel special, and then he moves on." Julia pressed for details, and what she uncovered was worse than she imagined. Noah hadn't just been cheating. He had been using company resources to cover his tracks. Emails, expense accounts, and even hotel bookings were all tied to the business. Julia sent everything to HR and copied the company's legal department. Noah's termination escalated into a lawsuit, and soon, his name was plastered all over the news. But even as Julia watched his downfall, she didn't feel better, because Evan was still gone. She tried calling him again, but he wouldn't answer. The divorce papers sat unsigned on the kitchen table, a constant reminder of everything she'd lost. One night, after too many glasses of wine, she sent him a long text. She poured her heart out, begging him to talk to her. The reply came hours later. "It's too late, Julia. Move on." That was the moment she realized she was truly alone. Her reputation at work never recovered. People stopped inviting her to lunch. Chelsea made sure everyone knew about the affair, and the whispers never stopped. When her boss finally called her into his office, she already knew what was coming. "We have to let you go," he said. "It's not personal, it's fine," Julia interrupted. She packed up her desk in silence, ignoring the stares as she walked out for the last time. Julia hit rock bottom. She sat alone in her apartment, surrounded by empty wine bottles and unopened mail. The divorce papers were still on the table, untouched. Her phone hadn't buzzed in days. Not from Evan, not from work, not even from Noah. It was as if her entire world had collapsed, and for the first time, she had no one to blame but herself. But the spiral didn't end there. The next morning, Julia woke up to a knock at the door. She opened it, expecting a delivery, but instead found Evan standing there. Her heart jumped. "Evan!" He held up his hand to stop her. "I'm not here to talk about us." Julia's throat tightened. "Then why are you here?" Evan stepped inside and dropped a folder onto the table, the same folder he'd shown her weeks ago. But this time, there were new documents inside. "Look at it," he said. Julia hesitated, but curiosity got the better of her. She flipped through the pages, her eyes widening with every word. Emails, financial statements, phone records. It didn't make sense at first, but then it hit her like a punch to the stomach. Noah hadn't just used her. He had set her up. "What is this?" she asked, her voice shaking. "It's evidence," Evan said. "Noah wasn't just cheating. He was stealing." Julia blinked. "Stealing?" "He's been embezzling company funds for months. Hotels, dinners, even gifts. All charged to the company. And because you were with him, it looks like you were in on it." Julia's blood ran cold. "No," she whispered. "That's not possible." Evan crossed his arms. "It is. And HR thinks so too. That's why they fired you, Julia. They think you were helping him." Her knees buckled, and she sank into a chair. "I didn't know." Evan's voice softened. "I believe you." Julia looked up, tears streaming down her face. "You do?" He nodded. "But it doesn't matter what I believe. The company's already building a case. If we don't stop this now, you could end up facing criminal charges." Julia's breath hitched. "What do I do?" Evan took a deep breath. "We fight back." It was the first time in weeks that Julia felt hope. Together they started piecing everything together. Evan had already hired a private investigator, someone who had been digging into Noah's financials long before Julia knew the truth. The deeper they looked, the worse it got. Noah hadn't just been skimming from the company. He'd set up fake vendors, fabricated expenses, and even forged signatures to cover his tracks. And Julia, she was his perfect scapegoat. Emails from her work account had been altered to authorize payments. Her name appeared on spreadsheets she'd never seen before. "He planned this," Julia said, her voice trembling. "From the beginning." Evan nodded. "And he's not done." Julia froze. "What do you mean?" Evan pulled out his phone and showed her the latest update from the company's legal team. Noah was suing them. "He's claiming wrongful termination," Evan said. "And he's pinning everything on you." Julia felt like she couldn't breathe. "He's saying it was your idea," Evan continued. "That you pressured him into it." Julia shot to her feet. "That's a lie." "I know," Evan said, "but he has evidence. Or at least, he thinks he does." Julia's hands shook as she flipped through the documents again. "I need to fix this." Evan's eyes softened. "We will." For the first time in weeks, Julia felt like she wasn't alone. But the clock was ticking. They only had days before Noah's case went to court, and the evidence against Julia was damning. She and Evan worked tirelessly, tracking down old emails, receipts, and bank statements, anything that could prove Noah had been acting alone. And then they found it. Buried in Noah's deleted files was a recording, a voicemail he'd left for one of his accomplices. "It's done," Noah's voice said. Julia signed off on everything. She has no idea what's happening. It was the smoking gun they needed. The next day, Julia and Evan handed everything over to the company's lawyers. Within hours, Noah's case fell apart. But Julia wasn't satisfied. She wanted to see Noah face the consequences. So, she pressed charges. The trial was brutal. Noah tried to paint himself as the victim, claiming Julia had manipulated him. But the evidence told a different story. Emails, transactions, recordings. And when Julia took the stand, she didn't hold back. "Noah Carter used me," she said, her voice steady. "He lied to me, to this company, and to everyone who trusted him. But I'm not the only victim, and today, I'm taking my life back." The jury didn't take long to deliberate. Noah was found guilty on multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, and the company recovered most of the stolen funds. But Julia's reputation wasn't so easily repaired. Even after the verdict, whispers followed her everywhere. She lost friends, job offers, and any sense of stability. Through it all, Evan stayed by her side, but things weren't the same. One night, after weeks of avoiding the subject, Julia finally asked him, "Why are you helping me?" Evan's jaw tightened. "Because I loved you." "Loved," she repeated. He didn't correct her. "I don't know if we can fix this," he admitted. "But I couldn't let you go through it alone." Julia nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you." And for the first time, she signed the divorce papers. Julia thought signing the divorce papers would bring closure. Instead, it felt like the final nail in the coffin of her old life. Evan had moved out completely, leaving nothing behind, not even the scent of his cologne. The house felt empty, but it wasn't just the lack of furniture. It was the silence, the absence of the laughter and shared routines that once made it feel like home. But Julia didn't have time to grieve. The fallout from Noah's trial wasn't over. A week after the verdict, Julia received an email from an anonymous sender. The subject line read, "It's not over." Her hands trembled as she clicked it open. Inside was a single attachment, a video. Julia hit play and immediately felt sick. It was security footage of her and Noah in the office parking garage, kissing. The timestamp was clear. Right before one of the fraudulent transactions had been approved. A message popped up underneath. "This goes public unless we talk, call me." The number belonged to Noah. Julia's heart pounded as she paced the living room. Noah was in prison. How was he sending emails, and what did he mean by talk? She considered ignoring it, but fear crept in. If that video leaked, people would assume she was guilty all over again. The whispers would come back. The humiliation. Julia had to know what Noah wanted. The next day she called Evan. She didn't want to, but he was the only one she trusted. "There's something you need to see," she said. When Evan arrived, Julia showed him the email. "This doesn't make sense," he said, studying the screen. "Noah doesn't have internet access in prison." "Then how did he send this?" Evan's jaw tightened. He didn't. He tapped the keyboard, tracing the email's metadata. Within minutes, he found the answer. "It was sent from the outside," he said. "Someone's helping him." Julia's stomach dropped. "Who?" Evan clicked through the files, and then he froze. "It's Chelsea," he said. Julia's eyes widened. "Chelsea from work?" Evan nodded. "She's the one who sent it." Everything clicked into place. Chelsea's smug looks, her constant questions about Julia's schedule, and her sudden interest in Noah after the trial. "She's working with him," Julia whispered. Evan grabbed his keys. "Let's go." They drove straight to Chelsea's apartment. Julia's hands shook the entire ride, but Evan didn't hesitate. He knocked hard enough to rattle the door. When Chelsea opened it, her face went pale. "We need to talk," Evan said, pushing past her. Chelsea tried to act calm. "What's this about?" Julia shoved the phone in her face. "You sent this." Chelsea's eyes darted to the screen, and then back to Julia. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me." Julia's voice cracked. "You've been helping Noah. Why?" Chelsea's mask slipped. "Because you don't deserve to get away with it," she snapped. "You ruined his life, Julia. He loved you, and you threw him under the bus." Julia's mouth fell open. "He lied to me. He used me." Chelsea crossed her arms. "No, you used him. You played innocent while you strung him along? Evan stepped forward. Where's the rest of the footage? Chelsea faltered. What footage? The backups, Evan said. We know you have them. Chelsea tried to dodge, but Evan grabbed her laptop and opened it. Within seconds, he found the files, the same incriminating videos Noah had threatened Julia with. Delete them, Julia said. Chelsea hesitated, but Evan leaned in. Or we take this to the police and add you to Noah's case. That did it. Chelsea's hands trembled as she deleted the files, one by one. When she finished, Julia grabbed the laptop and smashed it against the table. You're done, Julia said, her voice steady. Chelsea's eyes filled with tears. You'll regret this. But Julia didn't look back. When they got back to the car, Julia finally exhaled. It's over, she said. Evan shook his head. Not yet. Julia frowned. What do you mean? Evan pulled out his phone. We still need to find out who helped Noah get the files in the first place. Chelsea didn't do this alone. The next morning, Evan got his answer. One of Noah's former associates had been secretly visiting him in prison. The man was a tech specialist, someone Noah had used to plant the fake transactions. With Evan's help, Julia sent the evidence to the authorities. Within days, the associate was arrested, and Noah's case was reopened. This time, there was no escape. Noah's sentence was extended, and his accomplice faced new charges. For the first time in months, Julia felt like she could breathe. But the damage was done. Even after clearing her name, Julia couldn't go back to her old life. Her job was gone, her marriage was over, and her reputation was permanently scarred. Evan stayed in touch, but it was different now. They were friendly, cordial even, but the love was gone. One night, over coffee, Julia finally asked him the question that had been haunting her. Do you think we could ever start over? Evan sighed. I don't know. Too much has happened. Julia nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. I'm sorry, she said. So am I. They sat in silence, both knowing the truth. They couldn't go back. But as Julia watched Evan leave, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Closure. Julia thought the nightmare was over. Noah was locked away. Chelsea was exposed. And the evidence clearing her name was in the hands of the authorities. But just when she thought she could finally breathe, the storm came roaring back. It started with a phone call. Julia Bennett? The voice was unfamiliar, sharp and professional. Yes, who is this? This is Detective Marks with the Financial Crimes Division. We need you to come in for questioning. Julia's stomach dropped. What, why? It's about Noah Carter. New evidence has come to light. Julia's hands trembled as she hung up. She had already given statements, handed over files, and testified. What more could they possibly need? Evan agreed to go with her. He sat beside her in the police station, his presence steadying her nerves, even as her palms grew sweaty. The detective finally walked in and set a thick folder on the table. We've been reviewing the data recovered from Noah Carter's devices, he said, and we found something troubling. He opened the folder, revealing screenshots of emails that Julia didn't recognize but had apparently sent. That's not me, she said immediately. The detective leaned forward. These emails authorized several of the transactions Noah made. Julia's breath caught. No, I never sent those. They came from your account, the detective said, and the timestamps match your office hours. Evan leaned in. She's telling the truth. Noah hacked her account. He admitted as much during the investigation. The detective nodded. We considered that. But we also found drafts, emails that were saved, edited, and sent directly from your workstation. Julia's heart sank. Noah hadn't just framed her. He'd planted evidence right under her nose. Evan spoke up again. You have to check the system logs, look for external access or any inconsistencies. We already did. The detective folded his hands. There were no signs of tampering. Julia's voice cracked. What does this mean? It means we need more than your word to clear this up. The room started spinning. Julia couldn't believe it. After everything, she was back at square one, fighting for her freedom and her reputation. That night, she couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, replaying every decision, every mistake. She wanted to scream, to throw something, but instead, she picked up her phone and texted Evan. What if I can't fix this? The reply came quickly. You will. But Julia wasn't so sure. The next morning, Evan showed up at her door with coffee and a plan. "We're not giving up," he said. "We're going to prove this." Julia wiped her tears and nodded. "Where do we start?" They went back through Noah's files, looking for anything they might have missed. That's when Evan noticed something strange, an IP address that didn't match Julia's office computer. "This," he said, pointing at the screen. "It's a remote login." Julia's eyes widened. "But they said there was no tampering." "Because it wasn't external," Evan said. "This is a clone session someone mirrored your computer." Her stomach turned. "Who?" Evan started cross-referencing logs and found the answer. Chelsea. She hadn't just sent the blackmail emails. She had accessed Julia's account remotely to create the drafts. "This proves it wasn't you," Evan said. They rushed back to the police station, where Detective Marks reviewed the new evidence. "This changes things," he admitted. "We'll need to reopen the case against Chelsea." Julia exhaled, relief washing over her. But the battle wasn't over yet. Chelsea was arrested the next day, but she didn't go quietly. When Julia arrived at the station to give another statement, Chelsea was already in handcuffs, but her eyes were full of venom. "You think this is over?" Chelsea hissed. "I'm not the only one who wanted to see you fall." Julia froze. "What does that mean?" Chelsea smirked but didn't answer. Later that night, Julia got another email. This time, it wasn't from Chelsea or Noah. "You ruined everything. Now it's your turn." Attached was a photo of Julia's house, taken just minutes earlier. Her blood ran cold. Evan showed up minutes later, finding Julia clutching the phone with tears in her eyes. "I'm scared," she whispered. "You're not alone," he said, pulling her into his arms. But Julia wasn't willing to be a victim anymore. The next morning, she met with Detective Marks and handed over the email. This time, the investigation moved fast. Surveillance footage caught Chelsea's accomplice planting the camera outside Julia's house. It was the same tech specialist who had helped Noah. Within hours, he was arrested. The evidence piled up, and the case finally broke wide open. The authorities traced the schemes back to a network of fraudsters, all connected through Noah. And just like that, the nightmare ended. Julia stood in court as Chelsea and her accomplice were sentenced. She didn't look away when Chelsea turned to glare at her one last time. Julia had won, but the victory felt hollow. After the sentencing, Evan walked her to the parking lot. "It's over," he said. Julia nodded, but her voice was quiet. "I don't know what comes next." Evan gave her a small smile. "You'll figure it out." And for the first time, Julia believed him. Julia felt the weight lift, at least for a moment. With Chelsea and Noah's accomplice behind bars, the immediate danger was gone. But as the dust settled, a new kind of fear crept in. What now? Her job was gone, her reputation still tarnished, and despite Evan's support, their relationship felt irreparably broken. But Julia wasn't the same woman who had fallen into Noah's trap. She was done being the victim. A week after Chelsea's sentencing, Julia got a call from Detective Marks. "We found something else," he said. "You're going to want to see this." Julia's stomach tightened. She thought it was over. She thought she could move on. But the fear in Marks's voice told her otherwise. At the station, Marks laid out a file thick with documents, bank transfers, shell companies, and confidential contracts. "This wasn't just Noah and Chelsea," he said. "This goes deeper." Julia's breath caught. "How deep?" Marks pointed to a name at the top of the file. "Evan Bennett." Julia's world tilted. "No," she whispered. Marks didn't flinch. "We traced several transactions back to your joint account. It looks like Evan knew about Noah's scheme, and may have profited from it." Julia shook her head. "That's impossible. Evan helped me prove Noah's guilt. He saved me." "Or he covered his tracks," Marks said. "We don't have enough yet, but it's not looking good." Julia's hands trembled. She remembered how quickly Evan had jumped in to help, how he'd found evidence no one else could. Had it all been a setup? She left the station in a daze. Evan was waiting for her outside, smiling like nothing had changed. "How'd it go?" he asked. Julia stared at him, her heart racing. "You tell me." Evan's smile faded. "What's wrong?" Julia stepped back. "Were you involved?" Evan's face hardened. "What are you talking about?" "The transfers," Julia said. "The accounts, they traced it back to you." Evan's eyes widened. You think I did this? I don't know what to think, Julia said. But I need the truth. Evan's shoulders dropped. I didn't take anything. Then explain the transfers. He hesitated, just long enough to make her stomach churn. It wasn't what you think, he said finally. I was protecting you. Protecting me? Julia's voice cracked. By making it look like I was guilty? I didn't frame you, Evan snapped. But I had access to the accounts, and when I saw what Noah was doing, I moved the money to keep it safe. Julia froze. Safe? For you, Evan said. So you'd have something left after this mess. Her head spun. And you didn't think to tell me? I didn't want you to panic, Evan said. I thought I could fix it before anyone noticed. Julia stepped back. You lied. I was trying to help, Evan said, his voice cracking. You have to believe me. But Julia didn't know what to believe anymore. That night, she couldn't sleep. She replayed every conversation, every detail, that suddenly didn't add up. Evan had always been one step ahead. Was it because he'd been playing both sides? The next morning, Julia returned to the station and handed Marks everything she had. Emails, texts, even Evan's bank statements. I want to know the truth, she said. 2 days later, Marks called her back. It's worse than we thought, he said. The investigation uncovered a deeper connection between Evan and Noah. The two had been classmates in college, and Evan had helped Noah get hired at Julia's company. Julia felt sick. He planned this? Marks hesitated. Not exactly. Evan didn't know what Noah was planning at first, but when he found out, he didn't stop him. Julia's stomach turned. Why? Marks handed her another file, this one full of emails between Evan and Noah. Evan had debts, huge ones, and Noah had promised him a cut of the money if he helped cover the tracks. Julia's hands shook as she flipped through the emails. Evan had been there every step of the way, watching, waiting, and protecting himself. She felt like she couldn't breathe. The final blow came when Marks handed her a recording. Evan's voice, clear as day. Just keep her distracted, Evan said. She'll never figure it out. Julia dropped the file. The man she'd trusted, the man who'd promised to stand by her, had been lying from the start. The confrontation was inevitable. Evan was waiting at her house when she got back, but Julia didn't waste time. Tell me the truth, she said, holding up the file. Evan's face went pale. Julia. Don't lie to me, she screamed. He held up his hands. I didn't mean for this to happen. But it did, she said, tears streaming down her face. You used me. Evan stepped closer. I was trying to fix it. You destroyed me. Evan's voice cracked. I love you. No, Julia said, her voice breaking. You love the money, and now you're going to pay for it. Before Evan could stop her, Julia dialed Marks. She knows, Evan said. Julia stared at him. And now so do they. Evan didn't resist when the police arrived. He didn't fight, didn't plead. He just looked at Julia one last time, his eyes full of regret. But Julia didn't look away. This time, she wasn't the one begging. As Evan was taken away, Julia felt the weight finally lift. The lies, the betrayals, the guilt. It was all over. She had lost so much, but she had survived. And for the first time, she felt free. Julia sat in her empty house, staring at the front door Evan had walked through for the last time. The silence felt different now, heavier, like it was pressing against her chest. The police had taken him away without incident. No yelling, no last-minute confessions, just quiet resignation. But Julia couldn't shake the questions swirling in her mind. Had any of it been real? The late-night talks, the shared dreams, the vows they'd made, or had it all been part of a performance, a way for Evan to get close enough to destroy her? She poured herself a drink, but it didn't help. The betrayal still burned, and then her phone buzzed. She expected it to be Detective Marks with an update, but it wasn't. It was an unknown number. You think it's over. Think again. Julia's stomach dropped. She stared at the screen, her pulse racing. Was it Noah, Chelsea, Evan, or someone else entirely? The fear she thought she'd buried came rushing back. She checked the locks twice before pacing the living room, her mind spinning. The email was vague, but it didn't feel like an empty threat. Someone was still watching, waiting. The next day, Julia met with Marks. She showed him the email, but he wasn't surprised. "We've seen this before," he said. "Noah's network didn't operate alone. It's possible there are still loose ends we haven't caught." Julia felt like she was suffocating. "You mean I'm still a target?" Marks hesitated. "We're looking into it, but you need to be careful." Careful, that's all he could offer? Julia left the station feeling more vulnerable than ever. That night, she called Evan's lawyer, hoping for answers. "Has he said anything?" she asked. The lawyer sighed. "Evan's maintaining his story. He acted alone. But Julia, he asked me to tell you something." Julia's breath caught. "What?" "He said you were right about everything." Her chest tightened. Part of her wanted to scream. Another part wanted to cry. But there was no time for tears. The next morning, Julia woke up to another email. "I know where you'll be tonight." Attached was a photo of her car parked outside her gym. Julia's heart pounded. She called Marks immediately. "They're escalating," he said. "We're sending someone to watch your house." But Julia wasn't willing to wait for someone else to fix it. She started digging, pulling up old files, notes, and logs from her time at the company. If there was another player still out there, she was going to find them. Hours later, she found something. A name, Darren Mills, linked to multiple offshore accounts connected to Noah's operation. The problem, Darren wasn't just an outsider. He had been Evan's business partner years earlier. Julia's blood ran cold. She sent the file to Marks and paced the room, waiting for a call back. When it finally came, his tone was grim. "You need to get out of the house," he said. Julia froze. "Why?" "We traced the emails. They're coming from Mills's location. He's been following you." Julia grabbed her keys and ran to her car, but as she pulled out of the driveway, headlights appeared in her rearview mirror. Her heart raced. The car stayed close, too close. She took a sharp turn, hoping to lose them, but they followed. Her phone rang. It was Marks. "We're tracking your location," he said. "Don't stop driving." Julia gripped the wheel, her knuckles white. The car behind her sped up, closing the distance. She could barely breathe. "Keep going," Marks said. "We're almost there." But then her tires screeched as the car behind her bumped her bumper. Julia fought to stay in control, but the road was slick, and her car skidded. She veered off the road, slamming into a guardrail. The other car stopped. A man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a hood. Julia locked the doors and fumbled for her phone. "Marks, he's here." "We're seconds away," Marks said. The man pounded on her window. "You shouldn't have messed with us, Julia," he said. It was Darren. Julia's pulse raced. She searched for something, anything, she could use as a weapon. And then the sirens wailed. Darren turned just as the police cars surrounded them. "Get out of the car!" Mark shouted. Darren backed away, but it was too late. Officers tackled him to the ground. Julia's hands shook as Marks opened her door. "It's over," he said. But Julia wasn't sure she believed it. Back at the station, Marks explained everything. Darren had been Noah's silent partner from the beginning, funneling money through offshore accounts and pulling strings behind the scenes. When Noah went to prison, Darren panicked. He wanted to tie up loose ends, and Julia was at the top of the list. Julia exhaled, relief and exhaustion crashing over her. But it wasn't just fear she felt. It was anger. She had let people manipulate her, use her, and nearly destroy her life, but not anymore. The next day, Julia hired a lawyer to sue Darren and Noah's network for damages. She wouldn't just clear her name. She would rebuild it. As the weeks passed, Julia started putting the pieces of her life back together. She found a new job, one where no one whispered about her past. She sold the house, refusing to live in the shadow of old memories. And Evan. She didn't visit him in prison. She left his letters unopened, finally ready to let him go. By the time Darren's trial began, Julia sat confidently in the courtroom, no longer the woman who had been used and betrayed. She testified without breaking, her voice steady as she told the jury everything. And when the verdict came back, guilty, she didn't cry, because Julia Bennett wasn't broken anymore. She was stronger. Julia stood outside the courthouse, the cold breeze brushing against her skin. The verdict was in, guilty, and Darren Mills had been sentenced to 10 years in prison for conspiracy, harassment, and financial fraud. But even as the reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, and microphones pointed her way, Julia felt strangely calm. She didn't need their attention, or their headlines. She wasn't the victim anymore. The truth had come out, and more importantly, she had taken back control of her life. Weeks passed, and the pieces of her shattered world slowly began to fall back into place. Julia moved into a smaller apartment across town, leaving behind the house that had become a prison of memories. She redecorated it with bright colors and new furniture, creating a space that felt like hers, not theirs. No lingering shadows of Evan or Noah, just a fresh start. Her career took a turn, too. Instead of chasing high-profile corporate jobs, Julia decided to do something different. She started consulting, helping small businesses with marketing strategies. At first, the work felt foreign, but soon, she found herself enjoying the flexibility and freedom. For the first time in years, she wasn't chained to deadlines or office drama. And Evan? He sent letters from prison, each one filled with apologies and promises to change. Julia never wrote back. She didn't hate him anymore, but she also didn't owe him forgiveness. The last letter arrived 6 months later. "I'll always love you," he wrote, "but I know I lost you forever." Julia didn't cry when she read it. Instead, she smiled, a small, bittersweet smile, and tucked it away in a drawer she didn't plan to open again. As for Noah, he wasn't done making headlines. A former cellmate leaked more details about his schemes to the press, and suddenly, his name was everywhere. Stories about his manipulations and greed turned him into a cautionary tale, the kind business schools used to teach students what not to do. Julia didn't follow the stories closely. She had already moved on. One afternoon, she sat in a cafe, sipping coffee and reviewing notes for a new client, when her phone buzzed. It was Detective Marks. "Just wanted to let you know," he said. "The final appeals from Darren and Noah were denied. It's officially over." Julia exhaled. "Thank you." Marks hesitated. "You did good, Julia. Not everyone comes out of something like this stronger." Julia smiled. "Thanks, but I didn't have a choice." After hanging up, she stared out the window for a long moment. She wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time in a long time, that didn't scare her. Later that week, Julia decided to pay one last visit, to Evan's old storage unit. She hadn't gone through it since the divorce, but now, it felt like the final step. Inside, she found boxes filled with reminders of the life they'd built. Wedding photos, college keepsakes, and anniversary cards. She flipped through them, feeling the weight of what they'd lost, but also the relief of knowing it was behind her. And then she found something unexpected, an old journal she'd kept in college. Flipping through the pages, Julia saw the dreams she used to have. The plans she'd made before her life became about appearances and expectations. She closed the journal and smiled. It was time to start dreaming again. Months later, Julia stood at a networking event, passing out business cards and shaking hands. One of the guests recognized her name. "Weren't you part of that scandal?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Julia didn't flinch. "I was," she said, meeting his gaze. "And I survived it." She walked away before he could say anything else. By the time Julia got home that night, she felt lighter than she had in years. The ghosts of her past were still there, but they didn't haunt her anymore. Instead, they reminded her of how far she'd come. She poured herself a glass of wine, turned on some music, and danced around her apartment, finally free. And as she settled onto the couch, scrolling through her phone, she found herself smiling again. Not because she'd forgotten the pain, but because she'd learned how to live through it. Thank you for sticking with me through this story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more gripping tales, just like this one. Hit that notification bell so you never miss another story, and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'll see you in the next video.